Across a 1,800-mile frontier, the Wehrmacht ignites. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million soldiers pour eastward in columns so vast they darken the sky. Panzer divisions grinding through mud and grass. Stukas screaming overhead, artillery barking in rhythmic waves. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler sits in the Wolf's Lair, certain of victory. The Russians will break. They always break. The Führer has read his intelligence reports, studied Soviet industry, calculated Soviet manpower. He believes the Red Army will collapse within 3 months, 6 at most. The Lebensraum awaits. What Hitler did not calculate was this. The Soviet Union would answer invasion not with retreat, but with revolution. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin received the news with characteristic coldness. No panic, no desperation in his eyes. He understood something Hitler had dismissed entirely, that an empire fighting for extinction fights with ferocity that defies mathematics. The Germans could take territory. They could take cities, burn farms, destroy factories. But they could not take the Russian soul, not when the alternative was annihilation. By autumn 1941, the Wehrmacht had conquered half of Soviet territory. Moscow's towers were visible from German artillery positions. And yet, the Red Army did not surrender. It bled. It retreated. But it fought. Every day, another 10,000 German soldiers fell. Every night brought counterattacks that cost tens of thousands of Soviet lives but disrupted German logistics, stalled panzer advances, bought time. Time was what the Soviets needed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, a man with ice in his veins and a mind like a chess engine, began to see the math with perfect clarity. Germany had already conscripted every able-bodied male between 16 and 60. The Wehrmacht was cannibalizing divisions, rotating divisions, so exhausted they could barely hold ground. Replacements were dwindling. The German war machine, so magnificent at the moment of assault, was eating itself alive from the inside. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, 110 million women walked the streets, worked in factories, stood in bread lines, buried their husbands and sons, and watched the Germans advance with nothing but fury in their hearts. In a small apartment in Moscow, a young Communist Party official named Yevgenia Rudneva sat at a desk, reading casualty reports. She was a mathematician, brilliant, meticulous. She understood statistics. She understood that at the current rate of attrition, the Soviet Union would lose this war through sheer numerical exhaustion, unless they changed the game. She drafted a proposal, not to party leadership. They would never listen. But to Zhukov directly. A radical suggestion. What if the Soviet military formally mobilized its female population not as support staff, not as nurses, but as active combat soldiers? Pilots, tank commanders, snipers, anti-tank gunners, machine gunners, infantry, every role, every front. Zhukov read the proposal. He did not laugh. He did not dismiss it as propaganda material. He saw, with the clarity of a master strategist, that it was the only move that could tip the balance. He took it to Stalin. Stalin, who had murdered millions of his own people, who ruled through terror and calculation, approved it immediately. The German High Command, reading intelligence reports of Soviet women volunteers, dismissed the accounts as Soviet exaggeration. Surely no civilized military would field women in combat. Surely the Soviets were manufacturing propaganda to boost morale. The reports were filed away, footnotes in a war that seemed already won. This assumption would cost them the war itself. By early 1942, recruitment centers across the Soviet Union opened their doors to women. The response was instantaneous. Hundreds of thousands volunteered. Young women, older women, widows, factory workers, teachers, farmers, nurses who had already seen too much blood. They came to fight, not because they were conscripted, but because the Nazis had invaded their homeland, and they wanted vengeance. The lines formed before dawn. Women of every age, every background. Factory workers with calloused hands. School teachers in worn coats. Widows whose husbands lay frozen in the snow outside Leningrad. Girls barely 18, their faces hard with something beyond rage, with purpose. They stood in the cold, waiting to sign documents that would make them soldiers of the Soviet Union, not auxiliaries, not support personnel, combat infantry. One woman stepped forward. Her name was Rosa Shanina. She was 19 years old, from the northern city of Arkhangelsk, the daughter of a forester. She had grown up in the taiga, surrounded by pine forests and winter silence. She had learned to shoot before she learned to dance. Her father had taught her to track animals, to move through snow without sound, to understand the mathematics of distance and wind. These skills honed on elk and reindeer would soon be applied to human targets with lethal precision. But Rosa did not volunteer because she was a natural marksman. She volunteered because her brother had died at the front. The Soviet military did not have the luxury of turning anyone away. Training camps sprouted across the country, hastily constructed facilities where women learned to disassemble rifles, throw grenades, read maps, dig entrenchments, and understand the mechanics of modern warfare. The instruction was brutal. Soviet drill sergeants, many of them hardened Red Army veterans, showed no mercy. Women fainted from exhaustion. Women collapsed from hunger. Soviet rations were thin, calculated for survival, not comfort. Women wept, and they came back the next morning. By 1943, the Soviet military had formally organized 3 all-female combat units: the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment, the 1st Guards Women's Tank Brigade, and the 184th Rifle Regiment. But these were only the official formations. Across the Eastern Front, women had been integrated into regular rifle divisions, sniper brigades, and reconnaissance units. The total number would eventually reach 800,000. Not the 300,000 legend, but close enough to reshape the entire character of the war. The Wehrmacht intelligence officers received reports. Women in combat roles? They filed the reports with skepticism. Surely these were support units. Surely the Soviets were inflating numbers for propaganda purposes. Surely no disciplined military force would place women on the front lines where they would be captured, raped, murdered, where they would become liabilities rather than assets. The Wehrmacht was about to learn that calculation and contempt are often expensive luxuries. In training camps across the Soviet Union, women learned to kill. They learned to move under fire. They learned that fear, when channeled correctly, becomes focus. Major Marina Raskova, a legendary Soviet aviator who had made the first female nonstop flight from Moscow to the Far East, took command of the women's aviation regiments. She was 52 years old, a hero of the Soviet Union, and she understood something crucial. Women flying combat missions would be taken seriously only if they were, in every measurable way, superior to their male counterparts. So she drove them 14-hour days, navigation drills, gunnery exercises, equipment maintenance in freezing darkness. The women who survived training were not the strongest or the toughest. They were the most stubborn. In the sniper brigades, women like Rosa Shanina were being paired with older, experienced male snipers who taught them the craft of long-range assassination, how to calculate wind speed, how to adjust for distance and temperature and air density, how to lie motionless in a foxhole for 8 hours waiting for a target, how to pull a trigger and watch a man die through a rifle scope, how to live with what you had done. Rosa excelled. She had the gift. Steady hands, sharp eyes, and an emotional distance from killing that suggested she had been born for this. Her spotter, an older sergeant named Semyon Morozov, recognized her talent immediately. He began to teach her not just technique, but psychology. The enemy is not a man, he told her. The enemy is a target. Distance, calculation, physics. She understood. By autumn 1943, women were being deployed across the entire Eastern Front. Anti-tank rifle battalions, machine gun companies, sapper squads, engineer brigades. They were not isolated curiosities. They were becoming visible, undeniable proof that Soviet society had mobilized its entire population for total war. The Germans called them many things, some with grudging respect, others with contempt and revulsion, but they could not ignore them anymore. In October 1943, Rosa Shanina took her place in a sniper's nest near the front lines, a Mosin Nagant rifle in her hands, a spotting scope beside her, and fire in her chest. behind the German lines. She would spend the next 18 months changing the rules of warfare. She would never return home. The foxhole was frozen mud and broken branches. Rosa Shawnina lay in it motionless for 7 hours. Her finger was numb on the trigger guard. Ice crystals had formed in her eyelashes. Beside her, Semyon Morozov remained equally still, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching the German positions 300 meters distant across a landscape of white and gray. This was sniper warfare. Patience transmuted into lethality. A German officer appeared on the parapet of an enemy trench. He was checking fortifications, walking the line, confident in his authority. Rosa had been waiting for movement exactly like this. Morozov made a gesture, barely perceptible, a shift of his head. She had the target. She calculated the windage, the distance, the slight upward angle of her rifle. She breathed out slowly. Her finger tightened. The rifle cracked. Once, the German officer dropped, dead before his body hit the frozen ground. It was her 11th kill. By spring 1944, Rosa Shawnina had 43 confirmed kills. By summer, 59. She was not the highest-scoring female sniper on the Eastern Front. That distinction belonged to Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who had claimed 309 kills, but Rosa was ascending faster than any sniper, male or female, in the Red Army. At 19 years old, she had become a legend whispered through Soviet units. The girl from Arkhangelsk who could thread a bullet through a moving target at 400 meters, who had nerves of steel, who never missed. The Soviet propaganda apparatus, always quick to manufacture heroes, began to build her mythology. Newspapers printed photographs of Rosa in her uniform, rifle in hand, face impassive. Radio broadcasts told her story. She was given the rank of guard sergeant. She was awarded medals. She was made into something she had never wanted to be. Famous, but fame in a war zone is a liability. German High Command, reading intelligence reports of this young Soviet sniper with an impossible kill record, understood immediately what she represented. She was not just a soldier. She was proof that Soviet women could kill with the same efficiency as Soviet men. Worse, she was becoming a symbol to the Red Army. Proof that the Wehrmacht could be beaten by an enemy that had expanded its definition of who could fight. The Wehrmacht issued a directive. Rosa Shawnina must be eliminated. Snipers were dispatched to find her. Reconnaissance patrols were ordered to locate her position. German intelligence began to analyze her patterns, her likely ambush points, her movement patterns. They were not treating her as a woman or a curiosity. They were treating her as an existential threat, because she was. In October 1944, Rosa was reassigned to a new sector of the front near the Polish border. The Germans had learned her tactics, anticipated her movements. They had begun to counter-snipe. One of her spotters was killed by a German sniper's bullet, a message. "We know where you are. We can reach you." Rosa did not retreat. She did not request reassignment. She moved her position and continued hunting. In the frozen landscape of eastern Poland, she became even more aggressive. She began to set traps, using herself as bait to draw out German snipers and anti-tank teams. She would position herself where she wanted to be found, and when the Germans sent their best marksmen to kill her, she would be waiting. It was audacious. It was reckless. It was exactly what the Red Army needed during this phase of the war. Soldiers willing to absorb risk to degrade enemy capability. By January 1945, Rosa Shawnina had been credited with 59 confirmed kills. In the mathematics of warfare, that meant 59 German officers, NCOs, and specialists who would never issue orders again. 59 positions that had to be filled by less experienced, less capable soldiers. 59 small degradations of German capability, accumulated across 1,000 other snipers, combining to chip away at the Wehrmacht ability to resist. But the Germans were learning. They were adapting. And on January 14th, 1945, a German sniper found her first. Rosa was wounded in the abdomen by a counter-sniper's bullet. Severe, life-threatening. She was evacuated to a field hospital where Soviet surgeons fought to save her life. They succeeded. She survived. But her combat days, it seemed, were over, she would be sent home. She would recover. She would become a nurse or a factory worker or a schoolteacher. She would live. Except Rosa Shanina did not want to live the rest of her life as a war survivor. She wanted to die as a soldier. In late January 1945, barely healed, she volunteered for a reconnaissance mission behind German lines, against orders, against medical advice, against the pleas of her spotter, Morozov, who had taught her everything she knew. She would not come back. The aircraft looked like something from a museum. Plywood, canvas, wood-frame fuselage held together with piano wire and prayer. The Polikarpov U-2, a biplane designed in the 1920s as a training aircraft, slow, fragile, obsolete in every measurable way. It had no weapons, no armor, no radio. Top speed, 160 kilometers per hour. In a war where Messerschmitt fighters traveled at 600 kilometers per hour, the U-2 was a relic. And yet, Major Marina Raskova, the legendary Soviet aviator, had recognized something in this obsolete machine. Possibility. The U-2 could carry bombs. Small ones, but bombs. It could fly low and slow, which meant it could fly at night, when German fighters couldn't intercept it. And it was so slow, so unexpected, that German anti-aircraft crews often couldn't track it until it was already gone. Raskova had an idea, a radical one. What if you took this slow, defenseless aircraft and used it to harass the Germans all night long? What if you sent dozens of U-2s into the night sky, each carrying a small bomb load, each targeting German logistics, ammunition dumps, supply lines? The bombs would be small, insufficient to destroy anything of significance individually. But the noise, the disruption, the psychological terror of being attacked continuously throughout the night by an enemy you cannot see, cannot hit, cannot stop. And what if you staff these aircraft with women? The 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment was officially established in December 1942. By March 1943, they were flying combat missions, and they were immediately terrifying the Wehrmacht in ways that no strategic bomber could achieve. A German officer on the Eastern Front wrote in his diary, "Last night, the Russians sent their night bombers. We call them the Nachthexen, the night witches. They are the most infuriating enemy we face. You cannot shoot them down. You cannot escape them. You can only lie in your foxhole and listen as they circle overhead and wait for the bomb." The night witches were led by pilot Natalia Sabrova and navigator Polina Gelman, two women who had received their aviation training before the war and who understood, with precision, how to operate the U-2 at its absolute limits. They recruited other women aviators, Katya Budanova, Irina Sabrova, Raisa Aronova, young women, average age 23, many of them fresh from pilot training schools, learning to navigate by starlight, to find targets in darkness, to drop bombs by hand from the open cockpit while maintaining control of an aircraft that felt as fragile as a bird. The routine was merciless. Take off at dusk, fly low, so low that you could see the faces of German soldiers in trenches. Find a target, a fuel depot, an ammunition cache, a command post, a vehicle park. Approach from an unexpected angle. Cut the engine, glide silently over the target, drop the bomb by hand, restart the engine, escape into the darkness, return to base, refuel, reload, take off again. 8, 9, 10 sorties per night. A single pilot might fly 4 missions in a single evening, each one a journey into darkness and danger. Casualties were catastrophic. The U-2 had no armor. A single burst of machine gun fire could shred the canvas and wood. A lucky flak round could bring the aircraft down in flames. By the end of the war, the 46 Guards would lose 32 aircraft and 23 pilots killed. In a regiment that never exceeded 150 personnel, that was a mortality rate that would have been unthinkable in any other context. But the night witches kept flying. German anti-aircraft crews developed a specific hatred for them. The women were not honorable opponents in the traditional sense. They were not flying sleek fighters in daylight combat. They were sneaking through the darkness, launching surprise attacks, disrupting sleep and supply lines. Some German soldiers, captured and interrogated, expressed a kind of grudging respect. Others expressed pure fury. How could women do this? How could they be trusted with aircraft? How could they be so relentless? The answer was simple. They had nothing to lose and everything to prove. In the summer of 1943, pilot Katia Budanova was killed in combat, shot down by a German fighter pilot while escorting a transport aircraft. She had been awarded the Gold Star of the Soviet Union posthumously, one of only 2 women to receive it. In the Wehrmacht's view, this was inexplicable. Women did not die in combat. Women were not shot down by enemy fighters. And yet, here was proof that they did, and they were every bit as deadly as male pilots. By 1944, the Night Witches had flown over 23,000 combat sorties. They had dropped approximately 3,000 tons of bombs. They had earned the respect and the hatred of the entire Wehrmacht. German pilots, offered a choice of targets, often chose to avoid the Night Witches' airfield. The psychological toll of being unable to defeat an enemy, of being harassed relentlessly throughout the night, of knowing that sleep will be interrupted by the sound of 2 engines cutting and restarting. It was a form of psychological warfare more effective than any conventional bomb. Hitler had dismissed Soviet women as inferior. The Wehrmacht was discovering that these inferior women could make seasoned German soldiers question their own courage. And while the Night Witches harassed German supply lines from above, a different kind of Soviet woman was beginning to reshape the ground war entirely. It was the largest tank battle in human history. 2 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, a collision of industrial empires at a single point on the map. The Germans had called it Operation Citadel. The Soviets had called it certainty. They would win. And they did, but not for the reasons they had expected. The Wehrmacht had assembled every remaining panzer reserve for this offensive. Tigers, Panthers, Ferdinand tank destroyers, thousands of mechanized killing machines converging on a Soviet salient near the city of Kursk. German planners believed that one decisive blow, delivered with overwhelming force, could destroy the Soviet mobile forces and stabilize the Eastern Front. What the Germans did not know was that the Soviets had penetrated every layer of their intelligence, through agents embedded in the German High Command, through intercepted radio transmissions, through sheer espionage brilliance. The Soviet Military Intelligence Directorate, the GRU, knew exactly when offensive would begin, exactly where the main axis of attack would be, exactly how many tanks would be committed. Marshal Zhukov had prepared for this. He had established 7 layers of anti-tank defenses, thousands of anti-tank guns dug in at carefully calculated intervals, tank reserves positioned to counterattack, infantry entrenched in foxholes, and scattered throughout these positions, in 1s and 2s, were anti-tank rifle teams crewed by women. Their weapon was the PTRD, a 14.5mm anti-tank rifle, massive and unwieldy, with a recoil that could dislocate a shoulder if the shooter was not prepared. It could penetrate the armor of a Panzer IV at close range. It could stop a tank. And it required a steady hand, perfect aim, and nerves that did not break under fire. One such anti-tank team was positioned near the village of Panirai, commanded by a young woman named Alexei Fomichenko, who had changed her name to Alexander Fomichenko when she enlisted, because Soviet commanders were still reluctant to accept female soldiers in direct combat roles. She was 24 years old, and she had been waiting in her trench for 3 days. On July 5th, at 4:30 a.m., the German artillery began. Thousands of guns opened fire simultaneously. The earth shook. Explosions rippled across the Soviet positions like waves. Dust and smoke rose so thick that visibility dropped to meters. Soviet soldiers pressed themselves into the bottom of trenches, praying that their foxholes were deep enough, that their luck held, that they would survive the next hours. The artillery lasted 2 hours. When it finally ceased, the survivors emerged from their trenches to find the landscape utterly transformed. Trees were splintered to stumps. The earth was cratered. Bodies lay everywhere, some Soviet, some German from the first assault waves that had come during the bombardment. And then, through the smoke, came the tanks. They emerged from the haze like steel monsters. Panzers in columns, Panthers in waves. The entire Wehrmacht armored reserve advancing across the Soviet positions. The German soldiers had been told they were crushing a demoralized enemy. They did not understand that they were advancing into a carefully prepared killing zone from which there was no escape. Alexei Fomichenko waited in her trench, her anti-tank rifle loaded. Her loader, another woman, stood ready beside her. They had trained for this. They knew the angles. They knew the rates of fire. They knew that a Panzer IV had thin armor on the rear quarter panel, and if they could get a shot there at close range, they could penetrate. A Panzer IV rolled directly toward her position. 50 meters. 40 meters. She could see the commander's head in the turret hatch, could see the dust trail behind the vehicle. 30 meters. She fired. The 14.5 millimeter round struck the Panzer side armor at an angle. It did not penetrate. The Panzer did not slow. It rolled forward, crushing the edge of her trench, and Alexei threw herself flat as the vehicle passed over her position, its tracks pulverizing the frozen earth inches from her head. She lived only because the angle of the trench saved her. Seconds later, she was reloading. Another Panzer. Another shot. This one found the engine compartment. The German tank slowed, smoke pouring from its vents. It was not destroyed, but it was damaged, immobilized, forced to fall back for repairs. This repeated itself across the Kursk salient 1,000 times. Soviet anti-tank teams, many of them crewed by women, engaging German panzers at close range, sometimes winning, often dying, but always fighting, always resisting, always making the Germans pay for every meter of ground. By the end of the first day of Kursk, the Germans had advanced only 10 kilometers. By the third day, it was clear that the offensive had failed. The panzers had been ground down by Soviet anti-tank defenses. The infantry had suffered catastrophic casualties. The momentum had been lost. Operation Citadel collapsed. The Wehrmacht had been defeated not by a brilliant maneuver, but by the grinding, industrial application of firepower and will. And mixed into that wall of resistance were Soviet women, firing anti-tank rifles, manning machine guns, throwing grenades, dying in trenches. The German officers could not rationalize what had happened. They had been defeated by an enemy that had mobilized half its population. The women had not fought like women. They had fought like soldiers, precisely, coldly, lethally. For the first time, it occurred to the Wehrmacht hierarchy that they had not merely lost a battle, they had lost a war. The Wehrmacht was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to survive. The Soviet offensive that followed Kursk did not pause or consolidate. It accelerated. Marshal Zhukov, sensing the moment, committed every reserve, every unit, every last measure of Soviet military power to a relentless eastward drive that would not stop until Soviet flags flew over Berlin itself. The women soldiers of the Soviet Union were no longer exceptional. They had become routine and lethal. In the rifle divisions advancing through Poland and into Germany, women served as machine gunners, riflemen, platoon commanders, and junior officers. They were not concentrated into all-female units anymore. They had been integrated into the regular army structure, treated as soldiers, expected to perform at the same standard as their male counterparts. Some excelled, some died, all of them fought. In the sniper brigades, women continued to hunt German officers and specialists. The famous snipers, Lyudmila Pavlichenko with 309 kills, Rosa Shanina with her 59 confirmed kills before her final mission, had become symbols of Soviet lethality. But there were hundreds of other female snipers, lesser known, equally deadly. By the end of the war, female snipers of the Red Army had claimed over 12,000 confirmed kills. 12,000 German soldiers who would never fight again. 12,000 deaths at the hands of women the Wehrmacht had dismissed as incapable of warfare. In the aviation units, the night witches continued their relentless harassment of German positions. By the end of the war, they would fly 23,672 combat sorties, drop over 3,000 tons of ordnance, and establish themselves as the most feared nocturnal threat in the German order of battle. The 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment would be decorated with the highest honors of the Soviet Union. They would be formally recognized as Guards units, an honorific designation that acknowledged their status as elite soldiers. But recognition came at a cost. 23 pilots killed, 32 aircraft lost, a mortality rate that was unsustainable by any conventional standard. And yet, it had been sustained mission after mission, night after night, for nearly 2 years of continuous combat. The psychological impact on the Wehrmacht was immeasurable. German soldiers began to speak of Soviet women with a kind of fear that transcended normal combat anxiety. These were not women. They were something else, something harder, something without mercy. The propaganda that had depicted Soviet women as weak, as casualties of war to be pitted or exploited, had been inverted. Soviet women were warriors, and they were winning. In January 1945, Soviet forces reached the German border. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. Divisions that had begun the war at full strength were now fragments. A few hundred men commanded by officers who had seen their entire unit structure destroyed and rebuilt a dozen times. The attrition had become mathematical. Germany no longer had enough soldiers to replace the casualties. Germany no longer had enough resources to field new equipment. Germany was dying. And the Soviet Union, which had mobilized 800,000 women into active combat roles, was still advancing. By February 1945, Soviet forces had liberated Poland and were driving toward Germany itself. The Wehrmacht was executing a fighting retreat, but retreat was all it could do. The era of German offensive operations was over. The era of Soviet dominance had begun, and that dominance had been made possible, in no small measure, by the mobilization of Soviet women into every combat role the military could conceive. Hitler, in his final days in the bunker, received reports of Soviet women soldiers advancing toward Berlin, women commanding tank brigades, women leading assault squads, women firing anti-tank guns at German positions. The Führer, in his rage and desperation, declared that all Soviet women combatants captured would be executed, not as prisoners of war, but as war criminals for violating the natural order. It was a decree that came too late to matter. The women were already in Berlin. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Wehrmacht, which had entered the war believing it would conquer the Soviet Union within months, had instead been defeated by an enemy that had not merely resisted, but had fundamentally mobilized its entire population, including the half that the German ideology had deemed incapable of warfare. The Soviet women who had fought in this war returned to a country that did not always know what to do with them. Some became heroes, decorated and celebrated. Others faded into anonymity, their service acknowledged but not fully honored. The Soviet Union, which had praised female warriors during the war, was less enthusiastic about female independence during the peace. Many women were demobilized, returned to civilian life, expected to resume traditional roles. But they could never return to what they had been. They had killed, they had commanded, they had survived impossible circumstances. They had proven, in the most undeniable way possible, that the natural order Hitler had proclaimed was a fiction. Rosa Shahnina never came home from her final reconnaissance mission in January 1945. Her body was never found, but her legacy endured. A 19-year-old girl who had learned to shoot in a forest, who had volunteered to defend her homeland, who had claimed 59 confirmed kills, and who had died believing she had a choice in how her life would end. She was not unique. Thousands of Soviet women made similar choices. Thousands died in similar circumstances. They were not martyrs in a grand narrative. They were soldiers who had been given an opportunity and had seized it with ferocity. The Wehrmacht had called them inferior. History had a different verdict. The celebrations were brief. Moscow held parades. Soviet women in uniform marched through Red Square, while crowds cheered. Medals were distributed. Official photographs were taken. And then, quietly, the women were sent home. The demobilization was swift and, for many, humiliating. Women soldiers who had commanded platoons were returned to factory work. Pilots who had flown combat missions became test pilots or civilian aviation instructors, a step down from wartime status. Snipers who had killed dozens of enemies became school teachers. The Soviet state, which had praised female warriors when it needed them, became uncomfortable with their continued military presence once the war was won. This was not unique to the Soviet Union. Every nation that had mobilized women for wartime service faced the same dilemma. How do you send them home once they have tasted power? How do you convince them to accept traditional roles once they have commanded armies? In the Soviet Union, the answer was pragmatic and harsh. Women were demobilized. The all-female aviation regiments were disbanded. Female snipers were removed from active service. The 800,000 women who had fought were, within 2 years, reduced to a few thousand in permanent military positions. The Soviet Union would not field another major female combat unit for decades, but the memory remained. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the legendary sniper with 309 confirmed kills, became a propaganda tool. She was sent on tours of Western countries to give lectures about Soviet women's contributions to the war effort. In America, she was received with skepticism. American reporters could not quite believe that this young woman had killed hundreds of men. Some questioned the accuracy of her claims. Others suggested that Soviet numbers were inflated for propaganda purposes. Pavlichenko, disgusted by the reception, made a statement that would echo through history. "I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascists. Don't you think that, as a woman, I have the right to do this?" The question was not rhetorical. It was an indictment of a world that could mobilize women to kill when convenient, but refused to acknowledge their humanity when convenient no longer applied. Rosa Shanina's body was never recovered. She exists in history only through documents, her confirmed kills, her decorations, her service record. There are no photographs of her grave, no memorial, no final resting place where visitors can pay respects. She was a 19-year-old girl who volunteered to defend her homeland, became one of the most lethal snipers in the Red Army, and died in combat, and then vanished into the statistical anonymity of Soviet military records. Yet her story survived. Her exploits were documented. Her life, brief as it was, became a symbol of something larger, the moment when history forced the world to acknowledge that the old definitions no longer applied. Women could fight. Women could kill. Women could command. Women could die in combat. The Wehrmacht had entered the war convinced of German racial superiority and the natural inferiority of Slavic peoples, and particularly Slavic women. This ideology had not merely been challenged by Soviet women soldiers. It had been obliterated. The women of the Soviet Union had not been defeated. They had not been conquered. They had not been subjugated. They had fought, and in fighting, they had helped to destroy the very ideology that had declared them subhuman. This was a victory that transcended the military outcome of World War II. The cost of this victory was staggering. An estimated 14 million Soviet civilians died during the war, more than half the total casualties of the entire conflict. Soviet military casualties exceeded 8 million. Among the 800,000 women who served, an estimated 100,000 were killed in action, a mortality rate that, while lower than the overall Soviet military casualty rate, was still incomprehensible by the standards of any other military force. 100,000 women dead in trenches, in aircraft, in sniper nests, in assault squads, in tank brigades, dead because they had volunteered to defend their homeland against invasion, dead because their leadership had recognized that total war required the mobilization of the entire population, dead because they had proven, through their service, that the old definitions of warfare were obsolete. By 1950, most of these women had left the military. They had returned to civilian life, to factories, to schools, to villages. They carried with them the memory of what they had done and what they had sacrificed. Some found peace. Others spent the rest of their lives haunted by what they had seen and what they had done. The world, meanwhile, moved on. The United States and the Soviet Union became enemies. The Cold War began. New ideologies competed for dominance. And the contribution of Soviet women to the victory over Nazi Germany began to fade from Western consciousness. It would take decades for historians to fully acknowledge what had happened on the Eastern Front. It would take even longer for the world to understand that the liberation of Europe from Nazi tyranny had been achieved, in no small measure, by women who had been told they were incapable of warfare. Hitler had called them inferior savages. History would record them as heroes. In a Moscow museum, there is a photograph. A young woman in a military uniform, rifle in her hands, face impassive. The caption reads, Rosa Shanina, sniper, 59 confirmed kills, 1923 to 1945. Visitors pause in front of this image, and for a moment they see her, not as a symbol, not as a statistic, as a person. A girl who grew up in a forest, who learned to shoot, who volunteered to defend her homeland, who died believing she had chosen her own fate. In the archives of the Russian military, there are records of the women who served, documents listing names, ranks, service records, combat decorations. These archives are not well known. They are not widely accessible, but they exist. They are proof. The question that echoes across the decades is this: why did it take a total war, an existential threat to the Soviet state, to mobilize women as combat soldiers? Why did it require the invasion of Hitler's Germany to force the world to acknowledge that women could fight as effectively as men? The answer lies in ideology. Nazi ideology had declared women unfit for warfare. Soviet ideology, for all its brutality and contradictions, recognized that in a war for survival, you cannot afford the luxury of excluding half your population. This pragmatism, born of desperation, sustained by necessity, achieved something that democratic ideologies had not: the full integration of women into military combat roles. The women of the Soviet Union did not fight because they wanted to challenge gender norms. They fought because their homeland was invaded. They fought because they were asked. They fought because they could. And in fighting, they did something far more significant than winning battles or killing enemies. They proved that the old world, the world that had divided humanity into warriors and non-warriors based on gender, was obsolete. By the time the war ended, the world had seen what Soviet women had accomplished. Allied commanders had read intelligence reports about female snipers and female pilots. American and British newspapers had covered the night witches. The idea that women were incapable of warfare had been definitively disproven on the largest battlefield in human history. And yet, in the decade that followed, this truth was largely forgotten. In the Soviet Union, women were demobilized and returned to civilian life. The Cold War narrative, dominated by nuclear weapons and ideological competition, had little space for stories about female combat veterans. In the West, the triumph over Nazi Germany was attributed to American industrial capacity and British resolve. The Soviet contribution was grudgingly acknowledged. The female contribution to that Soviet triumph was largely ignored. It would not be until the late 20th century that historians began to seriously examine the role of women in the Soviet victory. By then, many of the women who had served were dead. Others were elderly, their stories fragmented by trauma and time. The night witches, in particular, became a subject of historical fascination, their story too dramatic, too improbable, to be entirely forgotten. Rosa Shanina remained a figure of legend and mystery, a sniper with 59 confirmed kills, a volunteer who died in combat at 19 years old, a person whose body was never found, whose grave remains unknown, who exists in history only through documents and the memories of those who knew her. But her story matters. It matters because it is the story of a young woman who was given an opportunity and seized it with absolute commitment. It matters because it demonstrates that given the choice, given the training, given the necessity, women will fight. They will kill. They will die. They will do what soldiers do. The Wehrmacht had believed that women were weak, that they were incapable of the hardness required for warfare, that they would break under pressure or be consumed by compassion. The women of the Soviet Union, Rosa Shanina, the night witches, the anti-tank crews, the snipers, the pilots, the infantry soldiers, proved this belief to be fatally wrong. In the process, they did not merely win battles. They shattered an ideology. They demonstrated that the natural order Hitler had proclaimed was a fiction. They showed that women could do what had previously been considered exclusively male. This is a legacy that echoes across the decades, not in monuments or museums, though those exist, but in the fundamental shift in human consciousness, in the knowledge that war, total war, requires the mobilization of an entire population. In the understanding that artificial restrictions on who can fight, who can kill, who can lead, are luxuries that few societies can afford. The Soviet women who fought in World War II did not set out to be revolutionaries. They set out to be soldiers. But in doing so, they became something larger. They became proof. Proof that the world's assumptions about women had been wrong. Proof that, given necessity, women would not merely survive in combat. They would excel. Hitler had called them inferior savages. He had believed that the Soviet Union, burdened with its non-Aryan population and its supposedly weak women, could never stand against the Wehrmacht. He had fundamentally miscalculated. He had confused ideology with reality. He had mistaken propaganda for truth. The women of the Soviet Union, armed with rifles and Mosin Nagants, with anti-tank guns and two biplanes, taught him his final lesson. That contempt, no matter how firmly believed, is no match for courage. That ideology, no matter how elaborately constructed, cannot withstand the force of human will. As the years pass, and those who fought grow old and pass away, the memory of what they accomplished grows fainter, but it does not disappear. In the archives, in the photographs, in the scattered memoirs and interviews, their story survives. And for those who take the time to listen, to read, to understand, the lesson remains clear. The next time someone tells you that a group of people is incapable of something, remember Rosa Shanina. Remember the night witches. Remember the 800,000 Soviet women who volunteered to fight for their homeland. Remember that history has a way of proving contempt wrong. And remember that the world changed on the Eastern Front when women picked up weapons and showed what they could do.